Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we are wrestling with a question that, on the surface, seems completely counterintuitive to our modern age.
It really does.
We are living in the 4.0 information era. I mean, if you need to, you can pull up a 20-minute video right now and get a solid primer on quantum physics, grasp the fundamental principles of macroeconomics, or understand how AI and blockchain theory are reshaping the future.
Instantly. The knowledge is just there.
Exactly. We are, by all accounts, a profoundly knowledgeable civilization about the external world.
And yet, here is the paradox that our stack of sources uncovered. If you ask that same highly knowledgeable individual, someone who can articulate complex global systems, a simple fundamental question that applies to them personally, what is your body trying to tell you right now?
They freeze.
They freeze, they
Yeah.
might laugh, they might change the subject, or they might simply admit, I honestly don't know.
And that silence, that sudden intellectual roadblock when faced with the self, is the core of our deep dive today. Our sources explore this phenomenon, which they term the flight from the body.
And the central finding is, frankly, astonishing. It's not just a casual gap in knowledge.
No, it's much deeper. The thing many young people fear most isn't failure, not poverty, not even chronic loneliness. It is truly knowing and understanding their own internal biological body.
And this is not an intelligence problem, which is what makes the analysis so compelling. The sources are absolutely clear on this.
Right.
This avoidance is not due to a lack of mental capacity. It's a profound systemic issue. We avoid this fundamental knowledge because we have been culturally and generationally taught to feel shame about our own biology.
A cultural inheritance.
Yes, an emotional barrier built layer by family, education, technology, and overwhelming social pressure, ultimately preventing, self-sovereignty.
So our mission today is to unpack the architecture of that shame. We're going to dive deep into the source material that identifies the forces that constructed this barrier, and perhaps more importantly, we're laying out the actionable steps.
The clear, small, non-shaming methods we can adopt to dismantle this fear and reclaim our body as an ally.
Okay, let's unpack this with what the sources call the 5 initial truths about this flight from the body, beginning with, the educational priorities we set.
Indeed. The cultural void starts with what we choose to emphasize in the crucial formative years.
Truth 1. Growing up in a culture of avoidance. This is the knowledge gap. The sources point out that we spend years teaching complex external systems, but we completely neglect the fundamental connections of our own internal living systems.
We teach them how a bill becomes a law, but not how an emotion becomes a hormone.
Exactly. No one systematically teaches us the direct physical link between, say, an emotion leading to a hormone release, which then impacts your sleep, which fuels your stress regulation.
Which then affects your immune function and ultimately determines your daily health and how you treat your body. It's a chain reaction.
And we're taught to just ignore it.
We treat it like a side detail in the grand curriculum of life. And when you don't understand how something works, especially something as crucial and complex as your own nervous and endocrine systems, you fear it. Fear, fundamentally, is born from ambiguity, from vagueness. We fear what is unnamed and what has been deemed culturally too sensitive or, improper to discuss scientifically.
So this avoidance teaches us an incredibly destructive habit from a young age. When we experience internal suffering, pain, fatigue, an emotional crash, the default response is just silence.
We let the problem grow uninvestigated because we are afraid to turn on the light and give it a name.
Let's connect this a little more technically, as the sources suggest. When we talk about the link between emotion and hormones, what specific mechanism are we failing to teach? Why does this ignorance lead to so much fear?
Well, it leads to what the sources call biological helplessness. Take, for instance, cortisol and adrenaline. We teach kids about fight or flight in evolutionary terms, which is fun.
As a historical concept, yeah.
Right. But we rarely teach them that chronic school stress or social anxiety keeps those hormones elevated long past the necessary moment of escape. So when a student feels that constant low-level anxiety, they don't attribute it to elevated cortisol disrupting their sleep cycle and digestive function.
They attribute it to a personal failing.
Exactly. I'm just weak, or I'm just bad at handling pressure. By failing to teach the mechanism, we deny them the objective language to manage their experience. The body isn't malfunctioning. It's reacting exactly as it should to a perceived threat. But without that knowledge, the reaction feels chaotic and frightening.
Which just intensifies the desire to run away from it, to flee from the body.
That's a vicious cycle.
That makes perfect sense. And that vulnerability to internal chaos leads us directly to truth 2. Society grafts shame onto bodily knowledge. This is where the cultural moralizing really, really sets in.
Oh, absolutely. The sources observe that even highly educated adults struggle to use specific neutral scientific terms like body, sexuality, hormones, cycle, or psychophysical health without,
A visible cringe, a bit of awkwardness.
visible signs of embarrassment, whispering, or just outright awkwardness. It is the social labeling that acts as the ultimate silencer.
And the sources highlight that across many cultures, the act of inquiry is weaponized.
It is. If a boy asks earnest questions about his changing body, he's often labeled bad, impure, or overly curious. If a girl inquires about her cycle or physical urges, she is immediately labeled immoral or promiscuous.
And if adults discuss it openly, scientifically, and without moralizing.
They're often deemed dirty or inappropriate.
Yeah.
These labels are social seals that effectively block off an entire area of knowledge by equating simple curiosity with a moral failure.
And this is where the sources draw that fascinating parallel to philosophy. They tap into the spirit of the existentialist Albert Camus, suggesting that the reason this knowledge is so terrifying is because of its raw authenticity.
The quote they use is, in spirit, "Man is afraid of truth not because it is great, but because it is naked."
And the body is, without question, the most naked truth we possess.
It is. It's inescapable. It's honest about your current condition, and it demands attention. You can't hide from it, you can't discard it, and you can't replace it. Yet instead of confronting this truth and seeking understanding, we're culturally conditioned to run from it.
Treating self-knowledge as the highest source of shame.
It's a rebellion against reality. We want to live in the realm of the ideal, the perfect image, the endless productivity, and the body constantly, and I mean constantly, pulls us back to the imperfect biological reality of being human.
Which brings us to a deep and painful irony. Truth 3. The fear grows with modernity. One would logically assume that in an age of abundant information, fear would naturally decrease.
You'd think so, right? More light, fewer shadows.
Exactly. Yet the sources find the opposite is true. The fear is escalating. So why is more information leading to less peace with the body?
This escalating fear is driven by a profound information overload, coupled with a total lack of contextual filtering. The sources point to 3 modern drivers. First, the proliferation of perfect, highly edited aesthetic standards, particularly on social media.
So we're constantly comparing our real functioning body against an impossible, photoshopped ideal.
Precisely. Any deviation, a stretch mark, a natural shape, or acne is perceived not as normal, but as a catastrophic failure. So we're not just afraid of being sick, we're afraid of being flawed according to an artificial standard.
That's the first driver. What's the second?
Second is information anxiety. A minor symptom, a transient pain, a new mole, when immediately Googled, is put through a catastrophic self-diagnosis filter.
Ah, the Google spiral.
The Google spiral. A simple headache doesn't just mean dehydration, it spirals into fear of a brain hemorrhage. The body instantly transforms from a biological machine into a ticking time bomb.
And third, the constant pressure to maintain an ideal image in career, in relationships, in appearance means any physical limitation, like fatigue or illness, is perceived as a massive failure of will or personal management.
We are terrified, not of the biological entity itself, but of the insurmountable expectations that we place upon it.
And that links seamlessly to Truth 4, facing our limits, the existential fear. Because if you genuinely understand how your body functions, you are immediately forced to confront its fragility, its finitude, its limits.
We are a culture that is just obsessed with feeling limitless. We romanticize the hustle. We celebrate working through the night on caffeine. We act invincible in our youth. The cultural message is always, you can overcome anything with sheer willpower.
But the body is the ultimate non-negotiable check on that human ambition, isn't it?
Absolutely. The body constantly reminds us, no, you have limits, you are not immortal, you are not omnipotent, and you must care for yourself. Understanding the body means accepting this finitude.
Accepting that you need 8 hours of sleep, that stress will physically manifest, that you will age and eventually fail.
And that acceptance of necessary limitation is precisely what modern culture, obsessed with endless productivity and defying boundaries, teaches us to reject and fear.
And finally, the ultimate consequence of this rejection. Truth 5, the fear of responsibility.
This one really hits home. The sources argue strongly that avoiding biological knowledge is often a profound, unconscious choice to avoid accountability for one's actions.
Because if we acknowledge that the body needs adequate sleep, nutrient-dense food, consistent exercise, genuine stress reduction, and slow living.
Then we are immediately obligated to change our behavior, often drastically. And change, especially the kind that requires sacrificing productivity or social expectations, is often perceived as tiring or too difficult.
So it's easier to choose ignorance.
It's easier to maintain the pretense that the truth isn't there, or that the pain will just go away. The source cites Camus again, reinforcing this. Truth is the burden of the awakened.
Once you know what your body needs, you can no longer live as though you are asleep to those needs.
That necessity for decisive action is the heavy burden many choose to avoid by remaining ignorant and fearful.
That sets the stage perfectly for how this systemic fear is transmitted. Part 1 of the sources states that the primary mechanism is the family, acting as a silent legacy passed down unconsciously generation to generation.
And we must start by emphasizing, as the sources do, that this is not about assigning blame. This fear is not an act of malice. It is a systemic, unwanted heirloom.
Most parents are simply repeating the cycle they experienced. They were never taught the appropriate non-shaming language, so they can't teach it constructively.
Exactly. But to break the cycle, we need to understand its mechanics. The sources define this generational silence through 3 distinct, overlapping layers.
Let's start with the simplest, most human layer. Layer 1, silence from embarrassment. This is just pure, raw awkwardness and historical conditioning.
Precisely. Think about the cultural environment in which many previous generations were raised. Using simple, accurate terms like body, sexuality, hormone, or menstrual cycle was instantly linked to taboo.
It caused genuine physical blushes.
It did. Therefore, the automatic, non-malicious reaction to a child's sincere inquiry was deflection or avoidance. They would dodge the question by changing the subject, scolding the child for asking, or using the classic deferral. You'll know when you grow up.
But this avoidance doesn't just defer the knowledge. It attaches a permanent emotional marker to it, doesn't it? It tells the child that the act of asking, the act of seeking self-knowledge, is somehow shameful or inappropriate.
Correct. The sources ask the critical question. How can you possibly know if the only information you receive is that the topic is off limits, and no one provides the vocabulary or the objective framework for understanding? This initial silence establishes the body as a secret.
And secrets breed fear.
They do, and that leads directly into the second, more externally focused layer. Layer 2, silence from fear of social judgment. This shifts the focus from internal embarrassment to external reputation.
This is about face.
It is. This layer demonstrates how collective cultural pressure supersedes individual needs. Parents often prioritize their reputation in the wider community over their child's necessary knowledge. They are terrified of neighborhood gossip or community members judging them.
Saying things like, they teach their kids about that sensitive subject too early, their children will be immoral, or their daughter asks improper questions.
Exactly. So the external fear of social judgment losing face outweighs the severe internal risk of the child's ignorance, confusion, and potential self-harm. They are essentially protecting their public image at the expense of their child's essential biological self-knowledge.
It's a profound sacrifice made to preserve social dignity. And the third layer is often the most tragic because it's not rooted in morality but practicality. Layer 3, silence from lack of language.
Meaning, they genuinely don't have the tools to communicate.
Right.
Many parents, having been raised in layer 1 and 2, genuinely lack the accurate, non-moralizing, objective vocabulary and the communication models necessary to discuss these topics comfortably. When faced with a complex question about puberty or hormones, they panic.
They don't have the script.
They don't have the script. So silence in this case becomes the default educational method, simply because they lack the appropriate, confident tools to do otherwise. This explains why shame is perpetuated. If you don't have the language for objective truth, all you have left is moral judgment.
And the sources are very clear about what happens in this vacuum. The moment official, reliable knowledge is absent, that void is instantly filled with distortion and anxiety.
Absolutely. When the reliable map of the body is withheld, that space is immediately occupied by highly harmful substitutes. False imaginings, playground rumors, limited peer stories, inaccurate media portrayals,
Unchecked Google searches,
and outdated fear-based warnings. The body itself is a neutral biological fact, but through these lenses of distortion, it becomes dangerous and hypersensitive. The sources compare it brilliantly to being afraid of ghosts in a dark room.
It's not that the room is haunted, it's that you refuse to turn on the light of knowledge to see what's really there.
Precisely. And we absorb this initial fear through what the sources call destructive little phrases. These aren't intentional malicious lectures, but daily microaggressions that build a toxic belief system.
Phrases that establish a subconscious conviction that the body is shameful, its needs are dirty, and self-care is over scrutiny.
Exactly. Think about the immediate impact of hearing. Sit properly to be dignified, which teaches that natural movement is somehow improper. Or boys must be strong, don't talk about pain, which teaches that pain is a weakness.
Or the big one, only improper girls ask those questions.
Right. It links female curiosity directly to immorality. These phrases train the child to ignore their internal signals and prioritize external appearance and stoic silence above all else.
The tragedy, again, is the vicious cycle. The parents are not malicious. They are simply survivors of the same shame system. They repeat the environment they experience because no one taught them the alternative.
And understanding this systemic cycle, as the sources strongly urge us to do, is vital. It lessens the feeling of individual blame or personal grievance and highlights the generational, cultural nature of the problem. Our task isn't to change their past.
It's to recognize how that past shapes our present anxiety and, crucially, stop the cycle from perpetuating. To really drive home the impact of these layers of silence, the sources provide poignant, everyday family scenarios, anecdotes that cross cultures but share the same emotional resonance. Let's look at the first example.
The examples show how quickly a door of knowledge is slammed shut, turning curiosity into shame. Consider the 13-year-old girl who bravely approaches her mother with a small, hesitant question about her changing body. Maybe a new physical sensation or an emotional surge she can't name.
And the mother's stern, immediate response is often, "You're too young, don't think silly things," or a simple deflection.
And that response instantly transforms the natural curiosity into profound shame, closing the door on learning. The subconscious message the child internalizes is, my questions are inappropriate and my body changes are silly or dirty.
Or the example of the 15-year-old boy facing new, confusing bodily changes and urges. He is desperate for clarity, yet terrified to approach his father.
Because the father constantly models hypermasculine toughness, stressing, a man must be tough, don't worry about trivial details or feelings.
So the boy has no safe avenue for objective discussion. He can't ask about nocturnal emissions or sudden voice changes or new anxieties.
So what does he do? He turns to mountains of false information on Google, where he is likely to find sensationalized or incorrect data. This only intensifies his fear and makes the unknown seem monstrous, all because the father prioritized emotional suppression over essential health education.
And the most dangerous long-term consequence mentioned in the sources. The 22-year-old enduring months of chronic pain or deep mental strain but being afraid to see a doctor. This is where the fear of judgment becomes lethal.
Why the fear? Because they know if they reveal their pain or distress, they risk their parents assuming they did something wrong, that they have engaged in unstandardized behavior, or that they are morally weak.
The body has been transformed into forbidden territory.
Which leads to catastrophic health neglect, all because seeking knowledge or treatment means risking moral judgment from their primary support system. The sources summarize this by noting this silence creates a state of primitive anxiety, drawing on the spirit of Kierkegaard.
Ah, yes. Let's integrate that philosophical point clearly. How does Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety map onto this fear of the body?
Well, Kierkegaard viewed anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, the profound psychological state we experience when we stand before a vast range of possibilities, or in this case, the unknown depths of ourselves.
So in this context, primitive anxiety is the fear we feel when we stand before the precipice of our own body.
Exactly. We know it holds truth and power, but we have no map and no framework. We fear it not because it is inherently scary, but because we were never given the navigational tools or the language to approach it safely. The anxiety stems from the potential for the body to reveal an uncomfortable truth that we have been taught to suppress.
So the family plants the seed of fear and silence. Now we look at how the institutions, specifically the education system and broader culture, water that seed, turning it into a deep-rooted societal psychological barrier.
If the family silence is rooted in personal embarrassment, the school system's silence is rooted in institutional fear of liability and controversy.
This is the prioritizing the head over the body problem. Schools teach complex formulas, historical theories, and external systems, but they treat the body as a side detail, or at best, a necessary container for the brain.
They neglect the crucial links between biological signs, emotional state, and learning capacity. How does chronic stress physically impact memory? What are the specific stages of sleep and how do they determine academic performance? The system demands that we understand the world outside our skin, but it systematically neglects the world inside us.
And this neglect often stems from the organized silence of the institution.
Absolutely. School often treats bodily knowledge as inherently sensitive or linked to sexuality, puberty, and instinctual drives, all things deemed institutionally inappropriate or messy.
An education system that actively fears confronting the basic biological reality of its students will inevitably produce a generation that also fears that reality within themselves.
It's the second layer of censorship. And even when health information is shared, the sources highlight that it's usually knowledge wrapped in shame.
The classic awkward health ed class.
Exactly. A visibly uncomfortable teacher reads dry, often abstract, clinical documents. Students giggle nervously out of acute embarrassment. Real, personal questions are instantly shut down or redirected.
And the entire curriculum is rushed to completion because the teacher cannot wait for the topic to be over.
And the outcome is disastrous because the educational purpose is completely subverted. The knowledge itself is instantly lost or forgotten because it's not connected to personal reality. But the shame, the powerful message that this subject is dirty, inappropriate, and uncomfortable remains and expands.
So students are forced to seek answers elsewhere.
In highly unreliable, often sensationalized sources. And that leads directly to the peer-led misinformation crisis, which the sources highlight as a major source of anxiety.
Because when institutional sources fail, peers become the primary avenue for intimate questions. They offer a non-judgmental, safe space.
But the information is based on limited experience, prejudice, or dangerous misinformation. This is where harmful ideas crystallize. The sources listed extremely damaging understandings that spread in these environments.
Like what?
Things like, this persistent stomachache must mean I'm dying, or long-term sadness is just a personality trait that I must endure, or difficulty sleeping and chronic anxiety is totally normal. Everyone has it.
These guesses, driven by fear and ignorance, are highly destructive because they lead young people to ignore vital physiological signals.
And deepen their fear of their body's complexity, often leading to them ignoring potentially dangerous warning signs.
And finally, the educational system sets up a specific cultural value through the grading system of self-worth.
The implicit teaching is clear and damaging. If you excel at external knowledge, math, history, languages, you are labeled smart and receive validation and praise.
But if you ask a sincere question about biological health, hormones, or emotional well-being, you're often met with judgment, silence, or told to focus on what matters, academics.
The system establishes a false hierarchy. Smart equals know the external world. Not smart or impure equals know your inner world. This reinforces the idea that bodily knowledge is academically inferior and morally suspect.
So now we layer on the powerful influence of broader culture, specifically focusing on the East Asian context, as highlighted by the sources, where these educational failures are deeply magnified by cultural values centered on external image.
The defining characteristic here is the absolute prioritizing of external image over truth. The cultural logic is that dignity and image, or face, must be maintained above all else.
Anything natural but perceived as imperfect or difficult must be suppressed, hidden, or denied because it reduces one's external image.
The source states the cultural logic clearly. If it's natural but not beautiful, right there will hide it. And when you hide reality, you turn that reality into a source of fear and self-loathing.
This pressure system leads to the moralization of the biological. The body ceases to be a functional biological machine and becomes a moral symbol.
Absolutely. Caring for the body is seen as odd or self-indulgent, and seeking treatment for certain issues is often seen as losing face. The paradox is that the more the body is treated as a moral test, the less it is understood scientifically.
Which just leads to rampant ignorance fueled by fear of cultural exposure.
Right. And this systematic cultural avoidance leads to a profound lack of internal vocabulary. If the culture avoids naming the truth, the individual lacks the mental infrastructure to name their own reality.
So real symptoms are habitually mislabeled.
Chronic stress becomes merely weakness of character. Insomnia is dismissed as silly thinking or lack of willpower. Painful or debilitating periods are minimized as making a big deal out of nothing.
And hormone changes are labeled simply as being moody or difficult.
A society without accurate words for internal reality produces a generation that is completely confused by the truth of its own inner life. They know they feel bad, but they don't have the objective words to explain why.
And this confusion is compounded by the culture of endurance and suffering. The sources highlight the deep cultural valorization of Stoicism, the idea of persisting through pain.
This is driven by constant cultural messaging, like, it's nothing, everyone deals with it, why can't you, or don't overreact. This powerfully trains people to habitually ignore their own vital signals. The body is not seen as a companion to be understood.
But merely something to endure through the day until you can rest.
And when you are forced to endure something for too long, you become terrified of looking closely at the actual damage. It's the fear of realizing the house is structurally unsound because you ignored the creaking for decades.
And because shame is not private here, but collective shame, the impact is magnified.
Correct. Shame about the body reflects not just on the individual, but on the parent's upbringing, the family honor, the lineage. A young person asking a sensitive question or admitting to a non-standard health issue instantly risks causing the adults their family to lose face.
This intense systemic pressure maintains silence, and it all leads to the individual's loss of body ownership and control.
If the body is regulated by pervasive social rules, strict moral codes, relentless aesthetic standards, and rigid gender norms, it doesn't truly belong to the individual. It belongs to the family, the teacher, the neighbor, and society.
And the sources emphasize that when an individual does not feel fundamental biological sovereignty over their own body, the intrinsic motivation to understand it, care for it, or seek its truth is lost entirely.
The individual treats the body as something managed by others' rules, not by its own needs.
So we have the inheritance of shame and the cultural systems reinforcing it. Now, let's bring this into the most current context. The sources argue that technology and the hyper-accelerated modern pace act as a powerful catalyst, deepening the fear while masking it with superficial connection.
The fundamental problem is the paradox of speed. We consume vast amounts of external data, hundreds of posts, videos, and conflicting ideas every single day. We are highly proficient at external information flow.
Yet we cannot spare 10 minutes observing our breath, or 3 minutes locating where our body holds tension or pain. We know how to hard reset a phone, but we have no idea how to reset our own biological systems, cortisol, dopamine, sleep debt.
The result is that the body is experienced as an utterly confusing stranger living inside our own house. And this acceleration is fueled by the fact that technology, particularly social media, forces us into viewing the body as an aesthetic arena.
The body is transformed from a vessel for living into a commodity to be judged and optimized.
It creates unrealistic standards, continuous comparison, and the pressure to be perfect 24/7. Curiosity about function is killed and replaced by anxiety about perfection.
The sources emphasize that an imperfect or natural body is immediately viewed as a flaw or a sign of lack of effort that needs to be urgently optimized through diets, intense exercise, or cosmetic intervention. It transforms self-care from a nurturing act into an aggressive, anxious project.
And this anxiety is magnified by the misinformation panic. The sources describe the common digital cascade. One small minor symptom instantly leads to catastrophic search results. A stomachache becomes cancer, a minor tremor leads to a neurological disaster diagnosis.
The fear of being chronically ill spreads faster than accurate scientific information, making the body feel like a ticking time bomb that is about to betray you.
The tragic irony is that this mass panic often paralyzes people. They are so terrified of the potential diagnosis they found online, the worst-case scenario, that they refuse to seek scientific understanding from a professional doctor.
Which escalates their anxiety into a permanent state of dread.
Compounding this is modern exhaustion. The relentless modern lifestyle, chronic sleep deprivation, excessive caffeine reliance, continuous work, chronic stress, and constant dopamine overstimulation from screens keeps the nervous system in a constant state of low-level alarm.
So when the body is operating on near-depleted reserves, perpetually running on the high of adrenaline and cortisol, every mundane symptom, every transient thought is interpreted as an existential threat.
The sources cited existentialism here. Nothing alienates man from himself more than busyness. We are literally too busy to be self-aware, making the body an easy target for fear.
And this perpetual stimulation leads to dopamine dysregulation and disconnection.
Constant scrolling causes sharp dopamine spikes and subsequent crashes, impairing focus and, critically, our ability to hear the body's subtle signals. We lose the capacity to distinguish between genuine hunger, genuine fatigue, genuine sadness, and mere stress.
The body is talking, but the chemical noise generated by the modern world is too loud to hear its subtle language.
And this confusion perpetuates a dangerous philosophical error, the false belief that sadness is psychological, but pain is physical. This creates a sharp, destructive separation. When we fail to connect chronic stress to cortisol or irritability to low blood sugar, we resort to profound self-blame.
When stress is high, we don't think, my hormone cycle is dysregulated, we think, I'm just weak or lazy or lack willpower.
This misattribution is a dangerous mistake. It multiplies the fear, adding self-condemnation and moral failure to the inner anxiety about the internal state.
Let's nail down the emotional root of all of this. Shame. The sources define shame not merely as a feeling, but as a mental command enforced by the collective.
Shame is the community's way of saying, this truth must not exist. It serves as a powerful, internalized social prohibition. This explains why we feel shame asking about natural bodily functions, symptoms, or hormone changes, even when we are entirely alone in our room.
We have internalized the social judgment.
The sources accurately term shame the spiritual chain we willingly wear. And this chain forces us to live according to the gaze of others. We perceive our own bodies through external, unattainable standards, the network images, the aesthetic criteria. This makes people terrified of being abnormal, losing face, or simply not meeting the standard.
Shame is the ultimate internal barrier preventing self-belonging.
And the deepest shame identified is the shame for the body's mere existence. This is the shame associated with natural, inevitable functions that don't conform to artificial social standards. Body odor, acne, natural weight gain, or involuntary biological functions.
This leads to the devastating feeling that one's body is inherently defective.
The sources reflect the essence of Kierkegaard here. Despair is rooted in trying to be the version society wants, instead of the authentic version one truly is. And because the culture moralizes the body, it's easy to start confusing knowledge with filth.
When curiosity is met with responses like gross, unhygienic, or improper, that conflation is complete.
Body equals filth. This is an incredibly effective tool for preventing self-care and knowledge-seeking. If the body is dirty, you don't want to look at it, you don't want to study it, and you avoid essential medical visits, compounding the health risk.
This intense internalized shame ultimately creates isolation.
Profoundly isolating. It pushes the individual into a dark, secret corner, making them believe their abnormality, their symptoms, or their confusion is unique. Since everyone is ashamed and hiding their true state, the collective silence reinforces the individual's feeling of unique abnormality, intensifying the fear into an unchecked, self-perpetuating loop.
So, if shame is the shadow, what is the philosophical path to dissolving it? The sources point to two historical guides.
Yes. Stoicism views shame as a social error of misaligned focus. It reminds us that nature is inherently rational and good. Marcus Aurelius, in Spirit, urges us, do not be ashamed of what is natural. Understanding the body is treated as a fundamental duty of the living.
It's about accepting nature and accepting limits without moralizing them, and existentialism.
The spirit of Camus and Sartre sees shame as a form of internal bondage that strips away ultimate freedom. For the existentialist, freedom is taking ownership of your existence. Shame forces us to constantly live according to the external judging viewpoint.
The philosophical confrontation asks the key question, which strips away the bondage. How would your life be different if you weren't so afraid of what others see?
Shame is the fear of that external gaze. Freedom begins when you reclaim your internal reality.
It's time to move from diagnosis to resolution. The sources make a decisive argument. The body is not the enemy we are fighting. In fact, it is our most loyal ally, constantly working to protect us.
This shift in perspective is everything. The body is intelligent, not chaotic. It always wants us to live and alerts us to danger. Pain is an alarm, anxiety is a warning, fatigue is a call for rest. We're not fighting the body is constantly defending us.
Even if we've learned to interpret its vital signals as inconvenience or threat.
Exactly. And here's where knowledge truly defeats fear. The body operates by laws, not caprice. No symptom, no emotional change, no physical discomfort arises randomly. They follow fixed, predictable, and observable biological laws.
So you need to understand the mechanics.
Right. Stress elevates cortisol. Positive interaction releases oxytocin. Rest regulates serotonin. When we understand these predictable laws, we stop fearing the symptom as a random, malicious attack. We recognize it as a mechanical process we can investigate, name, and potentially influence.
As the existentialists say, we only fear what has not been named.
When we name the biological process, the fear shrinks to manageable information. But a huge source of modern anxiety is the speed conflict. The body is slow, the age is fast. Our modern culture demands instant results and immediate recovery.
The sources really emphasize this mismatch. The mind and technology demand 10-second solutions.
But the body operates on ancient geological timelines. 21 days for a habit to solidify, months for the nervous system to recover from burnout, and years for date trauma healing. We mistakenly perceive the body as faulty simply because it can't keep up with our hyper-accelerated world.
The crucial takeaway is the body is right, the pace of the modern age is wrong.
We must reset our expectations to biological reality. The fear also comes from complicating what is simple, decoding the simple language. The body speaks a simple, non-judgmental language. Tired means rest. Anxious means avoid threat. Hungry means eat.
But the stressed, anxious, self-critical modern mind over-translates it into complex, self-condemning anxiety.
Tired means I am lazy and failing. Headache means I must have a serious disease. The fear stems not from the physical state itself, but from the catastrophic interpretation applied by the fearful mind. As Stoicism reminds us, it is not things that trouble us, but our judgment about things.
This realization leads to the peace of understanding. When that objective knowledge arrives, the knowledge that chronic irritability is a function of high cortisol and low blood sugar, not a personal character flaw. Self-blame simply disappears.
The body shifts from a zone of guilt to a zone that needs investigation and kindness. Understanding leads to calm, which allows for detached observation, which fosters friendship with the body, which naturally reduces shame.
The guilt is replaced by curiosity, and ultimately, this is about knowledge as the key to autonomy.
Society can judge and control the external appearance, but only the individual can truly understand, decode, and care for their internal biological reality. The sources conclude that understanding the body is the necessary first step to reclaiming fundamental self-sovereignty.
Let's get highly practical now. The sources provide clear, non-shaming, actionable steps to transition from fear to cooperation. These are small, consistent acts of self-belonging.
And the sources stress that sustainable change is not about massive willpower, it's about small, repeated acts of kindness toward the body.
Step 1. Observe without judgment, 30 seconds daily. The goal is pure, non-fixated awareness.
This is the essence of Stoic practice applied to the body. For 30 seconds, simply notice. Notice the breath without correcting it, the heart rate without panicking, the energy level without labeling it as good or bad. Simply ask, how am I feeling right now?
This quiet observational pause is the initial act of self-belonging. It moves you from reaction to observation.
Step 2. Name the bodily signals. Clarity is the antidote to fear. We must evolve past the vague language of, I'm fine, or I feel weird.
Translate discomfort into specific biological terms. A heavy chest isn't just freaking out.
It's nervous system stress, possibly related to hyperventilation. A headache is dehydration or screen strain. Naming turns the vague, terrifying threat into concrete, manageable information.
Step 3. Separate symptom from imagination, cognitive grounding. This is a powerful technique against health anxiety spirals.
The panic spiral is predictable. Real physical symptom, right arrow catastrophic imagination, right arrow intensified physical symptom. The sources suggest a quick 3-part intervention. 1. What is the body actually doing right now? 2. What is my mind imagining? 3. Is my thought based on evidence or sensation?
That 30-second pause is often enough to break the anxiety chain and re-anchor you to reality.
Step 4. Learn the right knowledge bit by bit. Reject the crash course mentality. The body is a lifelong curriculum. Do not attempt to learn everything at once. Focus on simple, foundational concepts slowly and consistently.
The mechanism of stress, basic sleep hygiene, how different nutrients affect energy, core hormone cycles.
Learning slowly ensures deep integration and application, moving the knowledge from abstract theory to applied wisdom, thereby sustaining the reduction of fear.
Step 5. Stand with, not against, the body. This is about replacing self-forcing and avoidance with support.
Stop treating the body as an unruly child to be disciplined. Instead, practice quiet, silent kindness. Provide what it consistently needs. Timely rest, enough water, sunlight exposure, mild activity, and reduced screen stimulation.
When you align your intentions with the body's needs, its needs align with your goals.
Step 6. Distinguish true emotion from biological reaction. This is a massive step toward eliminating self-condemnation. Recognize that what often feels like a failure of personality is a biological state.
Intense crankiness is often low blood sugar. Deep sadness is frequently sleep deprivation. Anxiety is often an adrenaline spike.
Laziness is likely burnout. Recognizing this removes the moral label, I'm a bad person, and replaces it with a need for self-care. I need food and rest.
Step 7. Selective sharing. You must curate your circle. Share your vulnerable internal inquiries only with safe, trusted people.
Those who are open-minded, non-judgmental, and scientifically inclined. Sharing with those who moralize, scoff, or dismiss your feelings will only double your shame and reinforce the fear you were trying to escape.
Step 8. Embrace slow change. The body does not operate at the speed of the internet.
The sources emphasize that the goal is consistency and kindness, not speed. Do not expect to eliminate decades of inherited shame or cultural conditioning in a few weeks. The great changes come from small, regular, non-aggressive steps repeated over time.
Step 9. Practice soft autonomy, guiding gently rather than commanding harshly.
Instead of using forceful language like, I must exercise 2 hours every day, use gentle guiding language. I will walk for 5 minutes after dinner. Soft autonomy means minimal pressure, which means less resistance and higher, more sustainable adherence.
It's the difference between being the body's dictator and its loving guide.
And finally, step 10, keep a body journal. This builds language and predictability where there was once only fear. Log simple, observable data. When does fatigue hit? What activity genuinely restores energy? How does stress manifest physically in different situations?
After 30 days, you will see the consistent, logical patterns of your body, replacing the fear of the unknown with the calm of predictability.
This is how you transform fear into cooperation.
This has been a profound, deep dive into the layers of self-alienation and fear. So let's synthesize what we've learned about the systemic nature of this fear. It is undeniably a multi-layered inheritance.
We can summarize this as a triangle of repression identified by the sources. The family planted the seed through silent avoidance and fear of social judgment. The school watered it through institutional silence, moralizing knowledge, and prioritizing external competency.
And society built the fence through constant judgment, unrealistic aesthetic standards, and the pressure of maintaining a perfect external image.
The fundamental realization must be that this fear is a cultural product, not a personal, individual flaw.
And both great philosophical traditions we touched on, Stoicism and Existentialism, ultimately agree on the path to freedom through self-acceptance.
Stoicism teaches us acceptance of our nature and limits, that the body is a natural, rational entity and not something to be ashamed of. Existentialism teaches us the radical necessity of taking responsibility for our full existence, owning the body's truth, and choosing to live authentically, free from the moralizing gaze of others.
The moment you stop running from your body, you begin your run toward freedom.
Exactly.
So we leave you, the learner, with the final, provocative question posed by our sources. It is the ultimate reflective prompt that brings this entire deep dive home. If you were no longer afraid of your body, if you truly trusted its signals, understood its needs, and accepted its limits, how would your life be fundamentally different?
Would you dare to slow down? Would you rest when needed, regardless of the cultural pressure to hustle? Would you seek help promptly, refusing to suffer in silence? Would you reject the fake standards of perfection and live authentically in your own skin?
Understanding the body is not just an obligation for health. It is the fundamental, most courageous step toward ultimate freedom, a concept agreed upon by every major philosophy.
It is the quiet, courageous opening of a new path toward self-belonging.
The deep dive ends not with a final answer, but with that quiet, courageous question for you to explore. Until next time, keep observing, keep learning, and keep asking the right questions of the self.